Welcome to the latest reaction event. If you're a new subscriber, new to Reaction, thank you for joining. You get access to the site, my newsletter, and invites to events like this with brilliant thinkers and writers and commentators. Speaking of which, Iain Dale, welcome.
Speaking of which, we haven't got one today, however.
No, not at all. Quite the opposite. Thank you for joining us. Iain Dale doesn't need any introduction. Broadcaster extraordinaire, brilliant insight, has brilliant insight into politics and media. And your new book is called "Why Can't We All Just Get Along? Shout Less, Listen More," which sounds like quite a good idea. Could that catch on, do you think?
Well, you live in hope, don't you? I originally wanted to call it "Gobbing Off," but I was told that meant something which I didn't know that it meant, so that was vetoed by the publishers. And look, in the end, I know it is a bit of a motherhood and apple pie title. I do get that, and I know that political debate can and in many ways should be quite robust, but there is a difference between robustness and just insults, and that's what we're getting so much of at the moment. You're on Twitter, Iain. You see it all the time. And if you are anyone remotely with a bit of a public profile, you see it all the time. And it's not just social media, it has to be said. I think the standard of our debate on mainstream media programs, on radio and television, has deteriorated over the years. And so what I've tried to do is analyse why that is. I don't think it's a new phenomenon. If you go back to the 19th century or 18th century and look at the cartoons of the time, I mean, there was fairly robust debate in those days, particularly on the floor of the House of Commons. But something has happened over the last few years, I think, to make it so horrible. And it's not just Brexit. I think Brexit was a symptom of this phenomenon, where and even people who weren't on social media managed to fall out with friends, with family members over it. The level of discourse on that just went into the sewer. And maybe I was naive and innocent, but I was actually quite shocked by this. You look at the statistic that 37% of Remainers would not want their son or daughter to marry a Brexiteer, 11% the other way around, make of that what you will. And I mean, that's emblematic of the way that we've become so intolerant to other people's views. And if we don't actually accept that someone has a right to hold a different opinion to ourselves, how can we possibly understand their motivations, understand their arguments, and actually marshal our own arguments against them?
To what extent do you think it is driven by the rise of social media? I mean, the media landscape that we grew up with was completely different, and trying to explain to people, say, under the age of 30 or 35 about a world before Twitter and Facebook and a world of newspapers and straightforward broadcast. I often wonder whether a big part of the problem is that quite a lot of the worst stuff that gets said on social media, as you describe, it's in a previous era, it might have been muttered at the radio or at the television and might occasionally have been turned into a letter to a newspaper, but it dissipated, didn't it? It sort of went off into now people send stuff off into the ether.
It's the spontaneity that is largely to blame, where if you're engaged in a debate on Twitter with someone and it gets a bit hot and they send you an insulting tweet, well, your natural reaction as a human being is to respond in kind and escalate the issue even further, and then it becomes a terrible thing. You couldn't have done that. Look, when I was cutting my political teeth in the 1980s, nuclear disarmament was the big divisive issue of the day. And I think we forget how divisive that was. But most people on my side of the argument recognise that those who believed in unilateral disarmament were not necessarily traitors. They didn't want to be invaded by Russia. They genuinely believed that unilateral disarmament was the way forward. Now, I found that an incredibly difficult thing to believe logically that could work, but I didn't impugn their motives on it. I mean, there were people who were a bit too pro-Russian, but leaving that to one side. Now, imagine that debate was carried out on Twitter.
Yeah, we'll get to Jeremy Corbyn later, no doubt. But Yes, precisely. I mean, it's not the case, is it? That, I mean, politics wasn't peaceful and calm in the 1980s. You had the miners' strike. You had, as you say, you had debates on nuclear disarmament. Do you think it is? Is it partly the case? And there was a report out, wasn't there, earlier this week, that suggested that actually quite a lot of it is people at the extremes, by which I don't necessarily just mean the extremes of opinion, but I mean they're very engaged. So on both sides of sort of left, right, Remain, Brexit, there seem to be about sort of 10% of the population that are really active on social media and very noisy, and same on the other side. And that then it may be that there's about sort of 70% of the country that's in the middle, that has one or other of those views, but isn't active on social media.
I think it's actually a lot more than 70%. I think the extremes, as you put it, and that's actually a bit of a divisive word in itself to use like this. It's actually people who feel really, really, really strongly about something. For example, on Brexit, Alistair Campbell and Andrew Adonis admitted to me that they'd basically got Brexit derangement syndrome, that they were so obsessed by it that it dominated their every waking thought. And if you look at the volume of tweets that both of them were tweeting during the height of all of the Brexit rows over proroguing Parliament and all the rest of it, I mean, Alistair Campbell has documented his own issues with mental health. Well, he now admits he went off the rails. And I think a lot of people do on both sides. This is not having a go at Remainers who feel strongly. It happened on the other side too. And people lost all sense of proportion, that they just couldn't accept that anybody could disagree with them. And if they did disagree with them, they were either thick, stupid, or racist, or probably all three. And you can mirror that into all sorts of different other areas where people feel incredibly passionately and they let their passions run away with them. And that, in a sense, is where we've identified the problem. But then you think, well, what do you do about that? And in the end, it's all about self-knowledge. You have to know yourself. And I don't know about you, but I don't think I really understood myself until I probably got to the age of 50. And a couple of years ago, someone, I can't remember where it was or who it was that said this. Someone said, Iain Dale is really nice on his radio show, but on Twitter, he's an absolute beast. And I thought, you know what? They're right. And I've really tried to calm down my Twitter presence in a way, because sometimes it just does run away with you. You get involved in an argument with somebody and it goes on for tweet after tweet after tweet at various temperatures. And I remember one night I was in bed, laptop on the pillow, arguing with an egg who had 4 followers, something to do with Brexit. And I thought, what are you doing?
Yeah.
I mean, this is not healthy. This is not right. And instead of sort of answering people immediately when they insult you, just take a little bit of time out. Don't feel you have to answer everybody that disagrees with you or sort of takes issue with something that you've said. What's the point in arguing with somebody who's literally got 3 or 4 followers? You don't even know that they're genuine half the time.
I mean, there is a positive side to it, though, isn't there? In the go back 20 years, there was very little opportunity for readers, listeners. I mean, radio's slightly different, but it didn't have this. It was pre that the explosion of talk radio, of which you're a great exponent. But it was very difficult to get heard, actually.
Yes.
So there's no doubt that the media had and media had power and knew it had power and could become quite boastful about it. So there is journalistic frustration that people are challenged. I mean, I just find it fascinating the way in which there are all of those downsides you list, but you also then end up sometimes in fascinating or amusing conversations with people on the other side of the political divide. Or it's brilliant when people actually point out something that you haven't considered, or that's the positive thing.
And it's a great source of information, particularly Twitter. I mean, okay, you can use Google, but sometimes if I don't know the answer to something, it's actually easier to just tweet it, and then people will give you the answer. you mentioned earlier that in previous decades, people could only have written to their local newspaper to get something off their chest, and their letter might get published once a year if they're lucky. Well, of course, once the internet started, you then had websites, but most of us didn't know how to create a website. We didn't understand the coding. So if we had a website and we wanted to change something, we had to send an email to our website person, who then maybe a couple of days later might put it on the website. Now then blogs came along, and I don't know about you, but I mean, you were involved in national newspapers at that time, and most national newspapers viewed bloggers as rather sad individuals, or some people who wanted to be journalists but hadn't quite made the grade. But once blogs caught on, they were a tremendous democratizing
Yeah.
factor that anybody could put their views out there. So Mrs. Miggins, if she had a view on what was happening to her local supermarket, for example, could then post a blog and maybe 30 people might read it. But so what? You didn't necessarily have to have a readership of thousands to be influential.
Yeah.
But then the mainstream media rather took over blogging.
Mm.
You were at the Telegraph at the time.
Mm.
The Telegraph had a fantastic range of blogs, and they tried to attract people like me to give up our individual blogs and then blog on their platforms. Now, a lot of
I
people,
think we had a meeting at the Telegraph about precisely that, and you
well,
sensibly said no.
I turned you down, didn't I?
Yes,
um,
quite right. Quite right.
the Spectator tried that too. In fact, they were willing to pay a lot more than you were, but I turned them down too.
I blame the
because,
Telegraph management.
well, because
But anyway,
I felt that it was kind of ruining blogging in a way. And I think that is what happened. That the mainstream media killed independent blogging. There are still independent blogs, but I mean, how many do any of us look at anymore? But then, of course, Twitter came along, and I didn't really understand what the attraction of Twitter was. I registered my name when it first started, just so nobody else could. But it was probably 2 or 3 years before it kind of clicked what you could do with it. And the spontaneity of Twitter also contributed to the death of blogs, because you could literally respond instantly, whereas blogging, it would still take a couple of minutes to get your blog post up.
yeah.
This whole issue of rapid reaction has in some ways enhanced our knowledge and conversation, but in many ways has detracted from it.
Yeah, I mean, you can't. It's really interesting what you say there about that blogging revolution, and you were a great exponent of it. Tim Montgomery, who introduced me to Twitter, and I said, this is obviously never going to catch on. And trust me, this is going to be a big thing in the life of journalists and readers. And he was right. And Tim always used to say that, I think it's absolutely right, and it's something that you did in your blogs, was that so many of the sort of word lengths and style things that we think of are actually just, they're a legacy of newspapers. You know, that's what an op-ed is, 1,200 words, because that's where it sits on the page as the main op-ed. And the beautiful thing about blogging, which I think it then had a big influence on journalism, positive influence, is that you didn't have to be constrained by that. You know, some of your best blog posts could be 3 paragraphs just because something grabbed
Yeah,
your attention, or a link to something else,
yeah.
or
No,
might be a much longer, almost kind of essay length. So I think it did. I think newspapers at that time knew that bloggers were onto something about changing reader habits, and you're right, tried to sort of borrow the best of it.
you mentioned Tim Montgomery there, and I think people don't realise enough how much he did to change things in the
Yeah,
world of political commentary. If you think about it, Conservative Home was ahead of its time in many ways, and all the other parties then tried to catch up with it, offering very pale imitations of what he set up. He had the idea for the 18 Doughty Street internet TV thing, which was probably 10 years ahead of its time. And he and I had terrible disagreements on that, where I thought, well, if you're going to call it television, you've got to actually do recorded television programs or live television programs. His view was, no, you do short video clips. That's what's going to impact on people. Now, that only lasted, 18 months, but I maintain to this day that if we continued with that, it would have been a really big thing now. GB News would not be needed if 18 Downing Street had continued to exist.
so I should point out that, so GB News is my old boss and friend, Andrew Neil. That's the new channel that he's
Yeah,
starting in January. Do you think? Just on that? Do you think there is this hunger? You've seen it at LBC where you present a show. There is this hunger for alternatives to the BBC, established broadcasters. Something's changing, isn't it?
I think there is an appetite for news. If you look at the news issues over the last 10 years, which I've been incredibly lucky to be able to cover on LBC, the interest in news now is far higher than I think it was 10 years ago. So there is an appetite. But you look at the audience figures for Sky News and the BBC News Channel, and they're pitiful. I mean, 20,000 people at any one time are probably watching Sky News. Now, if you look at that compared to radio audiences, and this has always been a matter of frustration for people in the radio industry, where politicians still seem to think that television is the superior medium and that they have to go on television to the exclusion of everything else. You look at the way they answer questions in press conferences, it's always the TV journalists that get the first questions. But when you look at the audience figures for Sky and the BBC News Channel, you wonder why that is. You can reach a far wider audience, probably of more normal people, going on a radio show like mine than you can on Sky News, because Sky News is, I mean, it's a great channel in many ways, but the audience is the media and the political world. I mean, normal people, apart from people who are obsessed by news, do not watch Sky News every hour of the day. They might switch it on if there's a terror attack or some big breaking news story, but generally they can't get the audiences. So I mean, I think it's great to have more news channels, but I just wonder what the financial model is for this, because I mean, you look at Times Radio, for example. They don't really, their only objective is to get more subscribers to the Times and the Sunday Times. That's their business model. Now, it's very different from what other radio stations are doing, and time will tell whether it works. But GB News will have to be funded, presumably, by advertising. Well, is there really the advertising to go round in that sector? I'm not sure. I wish it well.
So, a big strand of this book is what it's done to politics. The shorter attention span, the anger on social media. You clearly think it's done quite a lot of harm.
I think the idea that everybody has the attention span of a flea has done enormous harm to particularly the art of political interviewing. Do for a living, and I do a fast-paced news hour every evening at 7 o'clock where I'm doing 2, 3, 4-minute interviews. So I see this from both sides, where if you're doing a newsy program, you can't do half-hour long interviews. It is just not possible, because if you want to do a roundup of the day, you're probably covering on commercial radio, an hour is actually 45 minutes once you take out the ad breaks and the news bulletins. And other stuff. You've got 45 minutes in which you're probably looking to cover 12 stories. Now, you divide that up and you can see that you're not going to have a lot of room. I think it's different on a program like the Today program, for example, where you've got 3 hours where you have got a bit of time to breathe. But breakfast programs set the agenda for the day. They have to have a degree of pace about them too. But generally on the media now, you won't find very many places where there are interviews that are longer than, I mean, in the Today program, what's the longest? 10, 12 minutes generally. You haven't got the hour-long interrogation that Brian Walden or Jonathan Dimbleby would have given on a Sunday lunchtime. The longest interview on the Andrew Marr program is generally 15 to 18 minutes. Now, you can cover a lot of ground in 15 to 18 minutes. But what I've found when I do longer interviews, and I absolutely love doing half an hour or full hour long interviews, is that you haven't got this. The politician comes in a normal interview with 2 things they want to say, and they will say whatever you as the interviewer asks them, because they've been programmed by their spin doctors to do so generally. And so, and the interviewer on a newsy program is desperate to get a newsline because they've got pressure from their editors to do so. So I exaggerate to make a point here, but often the first question will be something along the lines of, why are you lying to me, Minister? Aren't you going to resign? Aren't you ashamed of yourself? Well, obviously the Minister's never going to say, well, yes, I am ashamed of myself. I'm banged to rights. I'm going to resign. Because, I mean, obviously that would be a great story. but they're human beings. I mean, believe it or not, politicians are human beings. They have emotions like anybody else. And if you're under attack, you're going to put the shutters up. You're going to get all defensive, and you will come out with robotic answers. And that's, I mean, Theresa May was a classic one at that.
Yeah.
But sometimes I've done say in a half-hour interview, I've lost count of the occasions when my newsline comes in minute 27 or minute 28, just when the producers are tearing their hair out thinking he's got nothing out of this interview. Suddenly, and I don't know what it is, but the politician relaxes and they've run out of all of the sound bites because it is a longer interview, and they then will say something quite interesting. I mean, what a surprise that is. So I think the internet has actually been brilliant, and podcasts have been brilliant in allowing people like me to do much longer interviews. I did a podcast with Andrea Leadsom the other day on my All Talk podcast, 78 minutes. Now they're normally about 60, but she was saying some interesting things, so we let it run. And I had so many people get in touch with me afterwards to say, I saw a side of Andrea Leadsom that I'd never seen before. Now, that's why politicians quite like doing these longer interviews, because they can be themselves a little bit more than they can in the set piece interview. So I think we are about to see a bit of a revival for that type of interviewing, because the audience like it. And in the end, you are serving an audience.
Do you think, though, that the audiences are now so sophisticated in media terms, or they know when they're being
Bullshitters.
savvy consumers, and we know when they're being sort of spun a line by a politician, so they can detect the line to take, can't they? And all those phrases like let me be clear, that gives a huge advantage, or it did until COVID, which I'm sure we'll come on to talk about the current crisis and what it's doing to politics in a moment. But that gives a huge advantage to a politician like Boris, who doesn't play by those rules. I remember being interviewed by you before he did he did an event, or I was sort of the preamble to it, and he turned up late and he was a shambles, and but the audience knows it's being kind of gamed by him. He's the kind of anti-media persona, but maybe that's not new. Ken Clarke was better organized in media terms.
It's not new, but I think people do. I mean, there's that anecdote that Jeremy Vine tells where he was at some awards dinner and Boris turned up completely like a minute before he was due to go on stage.
Yes, we ran the piece on reaction. It's a brilliant piece. Yeah,
scribbled a few notes and went up and made a brilliant speech. And then 3 weeks later was at another event and he did exactly the same thing. Now, people like to look at Boris Johnson as somebody who may be a bit shambolic, but they feel that he's genuine. But in anecdotes like that rather tend to prove the opposite. And I think people will forgive politicians a lot if they feel that they're being honest, upfront, and not trying to spin a line. But bluster can only take you so far in politics. When you're prime minister, you get found out sometimes.
We'll come to that in a moment. So the book, we direct people to your website, Iain, and they can buy a signed copy, and you can get it delivered to them. I really, really recommend it. It's fascinating. Don't agree with it all, but it's really stimulating.
What don't you agree with?
I think that I'm not sure I agreed with all of the arguments on 50 ways to improve public discourse. There's some, I think there's some fantastic ideas in it. We'll talk a bit about that idea. It's quite an interesting manifesto for change. 50 ideas. What's your favorite? And there's a great quote from Lombardy, Vincent Lombardy. Perfection is not attainable, but if we chase perfection, we can catch excellence. That's actually rather appropriate for what's going on at the moment, isn't it? But so you talk about self-improvement, debate and argument, mainstream media. The radio and TV broadcasters should think before they always go after the clip that will go viral.
Yeah.
Which is quite difficult, isn't it? Because I try and explain this to reaction supporters, or people who get in touch and read our stuff. Is that there's such a clamour now. You've got to try and grab attention. And
Well,
there's so much media out there and so much free media out there
yeah,
that
up to a point, but when you do it gratuitously, that's when I think. I mean, I don't know if you remember about 6 weeks ago, Mark Dolan, who's a presenter on Talk Radio, he was standing in on the Drive Time show, and he clearly felt he needed to make a name for himself. So he was talking about face masks, and his contention was that they were thoroughly useless and that nobody should bother wearing them. Well, you can have a view on that. And then he produced a pair of scissors. And because it was all being videoed, I mean, that's radio has now become a visual medium too. He cut a face mask up live on air. And I just thought to myself, is that really what we've descended to? Because now I have done a couple of things similar to this. And number 10,
nothing that bad.
no, but I mean, I did a few weeks before that. Gavin Williamson's performance over the exams, I thought was pretty shambolic. And do you remember on the day when they eventually did the U-turn, I thought he would give one of the Downing Street press conferences and explain it all and put himself up for questioning, but he didn't. He issued a 3-paragraph statement. And I read this statement out on my programme and spontaneously screwed it up and chucked it over my shoulder because I thought it was so pathetic.
Yeah.
Number 10, not very impressed by that, it has to be said. But that was spontaneous, whereas this was clearly pre-planned. And unless Mark Dolan goes into a studio with a pair of scissors every day, which I somehow doubt he does, he clearly had decided that would go viral. Well, it did, but not in a good way. But I mean, you look at James O'Brien effectively made his reputation on LBC over his Brexit videos, and it brought a huge number of new, younger listeners into the station. And he'd do these monologues about Brexit, and whatever you think of the content of them, they did have an impact on. I mean, he was preaching to the converted in a way, but some of them would get 1 million hits. And it turned him into a sort of quasi-celebrity, I suppose. And his
style is very, very different from your style. He's, to put it politely, I mean, big part of his shtick was explaining things in a very patronizing way to people who don't necessarily have the advantages that he has and haven't had the same sort of education in a really quite humiliating way, which is not your broadcasting style at all.
Well, it's not. He would take issue with how you've described him, I'm sure. And he is a very valued colleague, obviously. So I'm going to be quite careful. But look, I think he does what he does brilliantly. And I do take a slightly different approach in that I don't like preaching to the converted. I don't want to have 3 hours of people ringing in. Like now, I mean, Nigel Farage, who I think, by the way, is a great broadcaster, on his show, he was constantly getting loads of calls from people saying, "Oh, Nigel, you're my hero. I think you're fantastic." Well, of course, everybody likes to be liked and respected and all the rest of it. And I'm not going to say that if a caller rings in and says that to me, I immediately cut them off and move on to the next one. But I don't want 3 hours of it. And I think I want to be challenged. And we all have our different styles, but I mean, nobody can say that James doesn't work because I mean, his audience in the last 4 years has doubled. And I mean, he's nearly got as many listeners as Nick Ferrari on The Breakfast Show does, which for a mid-morning show is a tremendous achievement. And no one can take that away from him at all.
I liked your suggestion on Question Time, the BBC famous, rather than infamous political panel show. So you said programs like Question Time should retreat from the bear pit atmosphere that is encouraged at the moment. Which actually, I have to say we are, because we're doing more of these events on Reaction and we're doing more YouTube stuff. So we're launching a little show in a couple of weeks' time called Answer Time, which is actually kind of our little antidote to Question Time. And there is this appetite, isn't there, for conversation and productive conversation and conversation where there's genuine disagreement and it doesn't turn into a binary.
Well, you're absolutely right on that. And I was on Question Time last September and there were 6 people on the panel, 6. And it was all about Brexit. It was a live show and it was a nightmare.
You describe it brilliantly in the book. You end up, the whole show, I think you end up with about sort of 2.5 minutes.
Yeah. Now, people can say, well, that's my fault. But I thought, well, I'm not going to indulge in this orgy of speaking over somebody else. It's just the viewers at home just won't like it. And I nearly walked out of it because it was just so awful. Anyway, I then was asked by the Telegraph to write a column about it, which I did. Surprised to say, I've never been invited back on Question Time. Now, I do a programme like this called Cross Question on a Wednesday evening at 8 on LBC. Last night we did an American election special, and the questions come from our callers. We don't know what they are. They ring in. We have a panel of 4, which I think is important actually, not to go over 4. James Delingpole was one of them. Kate Andrews, and Bonnie Greer and Simon Marks, our US reporter. And I thought that could have got quite spicy in a bad way if it hadn't been controlled properly. But I thought, if you go, it's available on YouTube on the LBC channel. I thought that was a perfect example of a discussion program where the audience actually came away from it learning something. Now, they wouldn't have agreed with everything that was said by each of the panelists. James Delingpole, he was the only overt Trump supporter on the panel, which, of course, it's actually quite difficult to find Trump
There
supporters.
are many. I mean, if you look, look at the polling, I mean, this is Farage last night, who at the rally was praising Trump and saying he was the bravest, most decent person he'd ever encountered. I mean, that if you look at the polling, Trump is popular with about sort of 10% of the British public.
Yeah.
They approve of him, but wildly popular. It's Nigel Farage and about 30 other people.
Well, it is. And so we get slated because we don't have enough Trump supporters on. I'm doing 7 hours on US election night on LBC. And believe me, finding people in Britain to come on and talk positively about Donald Trump is not an easy task. Now, we've got loads from America, so it'll be fine. But it was a bit like in the Brexit debate. I kept being invited onto Newsnight, like almost literally sometimes twice a week, to take part in their panels. And it was always, of course, me against 2, or sometimes they tried to get 3 other Remainers. And there was one time where I said, I'm not coming on. I said, I can look after myself on the panel, but I'm not going to appear on a panel alongside Alistair Campbell, Matthew Parris, and Fazia Shaheen. I said, if you say that you'll give me 50% of the airtime, I'll do it. But you won't, will you? And the upshot was that I got them to dump Alistair Campbell, which remains one of my proudest achievements in my career.
Yes, the Brexit, it was really mad. I have to say, I did the Financial Times Weekend Festival. They do this big festival at Kenwood House, or they did until the crisis started.
Yeah, I was supposed to do that this year, but
I did it as a. They realised they didn't have. I don't think they had anyone who voted for Brexit on any panel anywhere over a whole day's event. So I did it, and the lineup was, it was a tent full of about 800 people, not many Brexiteers, and it was me, Fintan O'Toole, and Alistair Campbell, and Miranda Green, I think, was on the panel, and it was a strange year. It's a strange year. Shall we talk a bit about where we are on contemporary politics?
Sure.
And COVID being a game changer. How much trouble, and we're going to come to open things up for some questions soon. So email us questions, or there's a Q&A function on here where I can see stuff as it comes in. And we have some great questions from people sent in advance. How much trouble do you think the Tories are in now as a result of this COVID situation?
Well, they probably ought to be in a lot more trouble than they actually are. If you look at the national opinion polls, it's remarkable how they're still over 40% and still in many polls having a lead over Labour. Some of them are equal. There have been a couple showing a Labour lead. I suspect today's events on the HCR report are not going to help Labour in that regard. So I think they are in reasonable shape in terms of the fact that the election is quite a long way away. But if we are having this conversation in 6 months and COVID-19 is still very present in the country, I wonder how long people will give the government a bit of slack on this, and I think they did at the beginning, because no government could have been prepared for it in the way that some people think they ought to have been, whether it's PPE, whether it's track and trace or whatever. I don't think I don't think there's a single comparable nation in the world, and New Zealand, by the way, is not a comparable nation. I don't think there is a single comparable nation that has actually handled this crisis in a markedly different way and had huge success. I think the general public felt that the economic packages that were announced at the beginning were far more generous than they would have expected, maybe from a Conservative government.
Mm.
I think that they cut them a lot of slack over the care homes, PPE, and whatever. But 7 months on, there are still remarkably many problems that don't seem to have been addressed properly. Now, test and trace is the obvious one that people scratch their heads and think, well, we are 7 months on now. Why isn't this working how it should do? And you can say, well, France's test and trace system has collapsed. Belgium's has. And you can say that till you're blue in the face. It doesn't seem to have any impact at all on anyone. And I think one of the media's failings in this whole crisis, and it's actually starting to change now, but certainly up until the last couple of weeks, nobody really covered what was going on in other countries to any great extent. It was all America and how terrible Trump had done. They didn't really, once the initial spikes had happened in Spain and Italy, they went completely off the agenda. Even in France, the most comparable country, I think, to us in many ways, there hasn't really been an awful lot of coverage about what's gone on there. But there ought to be, because we are 2, 3, 4 weeks behind France, and what's happening there at the moment, believe me, is probably going to happen here too. And the government, I hope, are trying to learn the lessons of what hasn't happened in France. And you've got Germany now going to a partial lockdown too. Belgium is a complete basket case, and they've got the nearest population density to us, I think. I don't know what they've got in store, but we've got to start thinking about what happens if they do go into some sort of national lockdown, which I think is now looking almost inevitable at some point.
Yeah, we've actually on reaction, we've actually moved back of late to looking. There's a hunger for people to learn more about what is going on in other countries.
Yeah.
The site yesterday on Spain, with France is fascinating. Germany's really, really interesting at the moment. If you look at the problems that they're having with test and trace, and it may be that actually our whole original conception, I mean, Western Europe, of how this should work with this vast nationwide infrastructure, which can test huge numbers of people, that actually it may be, and the Germans are reversing out of that into doing something much more targeted and focusing it on key workers, care workers, hospitals, people who needed to keep emergency services going, and trying to spot super spreaders there rather than treating the entire country as being equally susceptible to this, which is clearly not the case. Which brings me to my point about modern media and this crisis. I don't know the answer to this. I just would be interested to hear what you think, Iain. Is that it's very difficult in this climate that you describe very well in the book for people to admit the truth about this, which is we don't know. And that actually a lot of the things that we started out in the crisis with, right? It's all about antibody tests, which was a big thing in April. That was the game changer. Then it was going to be test and trace, world beating, and the government has pandered to this in the UK. So they're not blameless, but isn't the reality? And it's very, very difficult for a leader, for any leader, but particularly a leader like Boris, who likes to be upbeat and boosterish, is that we're learning about this all the time, and we're making lots of mistakes as we go, and there isn't a correct answer.
No, and I wish not just Boris, but most of the cabinet had been more upfront about this right from the beginning, because they kept, and they have actually, I can't remember the last time I heard them say this, but one of their little sound bites at the beginning was, well, we've made all the right decisions at the right time. And as soon as I heard them say that, I thought, well, you might want to do that. Obviously, you want to do that. Who wouldn't? But it's impossible in a pandemic like this to maintain that A, you've made all the right decisions, and B, you've made them at the right time. It's just not possible to do. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to work that out. And I think that is something that they should just stop doing. And generally, politicians who admit that they don't know something, or they apologise for something that it does become apparent where they've made the wrong decision. It's very rare that a politician lives to regret that. The only example of that I can think of is Nick Clegg on tuition fees, where it just didn't wash with people. But generally, I'm sorry is quite a powerful thing for a politician to say. But I don't really remember anybody uttering those words or even coming close to admitting that they have made wrong decisions, which I think is wrong. The other thing that I think we've learned is that science is not science. Now, I'm not a scientist, don't pretend to be, but I did kind of think that, well, science was quite provable. But we now know that scientists are effectively like economists. You can have 364 opinions, and then the politicians have to judge which ones are right.
Yeah.
And we don't have government by scientists, and nor should we have government by scientists. Politicians are there to make the decisions on our behalf after weighing up all of the considerations, not just the scientific ones. And the reporting of that SAGE paper the other day, where they said we should go into a lockdown, most of the reporting of that omitted the paragraph at the end where they said, but we recognise that there are other considerations here. If we were governing it from just the science, this is what we'd do. But we recognise you have to consider the economic and social and society considerations too. Where did you hear that reported? Very, very few places, I would venture to suggest. So I think it's incredibly difficult for anybody in charge of these events. I have incredible sympathy for them. I'm sure you've thought about this. You thought, well, if I was in their situation, what would I do now, and how would I explain it? Again, when you're watching Question Time, you probably do the same thing as me, where so an audience member asks a question, and you think, well, if I was on the panel, how would I answer that? And often I think, I don't know what I'd say. Of course, when you're actually on the programme, the adrenaline's flowing, and whatever the question is, you think of something to say. But it's an incredibly difficult position for people to be in, where there is no precedent for this whatsoever. You haven't got a rule book, you are making it up as you go along. And I think the British public have had a lot of sympathy on that, but I just wonder how long that sympathy is going to be there for.
Yeah. No, it is. You phrase it very, very well. I mean, personally, I mean, lots of us fell for that shtick about the science very early in the crisis. Something I was guilty of. I think I wrote in my Times column in March, in the middle of it all. Certainly thought it was going to be very serious, but didn't think it would be anything as serious as it turned out to be. It was a comforting thing to say. Look, the government says it's following the science. That's obviously the sensible thing to do. We now discover that is simply, is almost meaningless, really, actually, and maybe an entirely different approach would have worked, where you very aggressively shield the vulnerable and the elderly. I mean, this is the thing which, to me, longer term, if this is now not just a 6, 7, 8 month event, that if there's going to be something like another lockdown, I really hope there isn't, and then maybe something again in the spring, and unless there's a vaccine, but if this is turning into a two-year event, and we don't know what the year after will be like, how can we, in all conscience, advise or try and force those who are under 40, that doesn't cover us, who are not at serious risk from this disease, which is serious? How can we, year after year, destroy their life chances and their opportunities, and for a disease which kills primarily, it's a serious disease, but primarily kills those over the age of 75.
Two things on that. There was an article in the Daily Mail this morning that revealed, and I may have got this slightly wrong, 17 deaths under the age of 40 in the last month. Now, if I've got that right, I mean, whatever the figure was, it was that of that kind of magnitude. Now, you cannot justify, therefore, locking down people under the age of 40 if there is comparably little risk to them. However, there is still a risk from long COVID. I know probably at least 6 people under the age of 30 or under the age of 40 who are suffering terribly from the effects of long COVID. And this is not something to be underestimated. It's a terribly debilitating thing. Now, nobody knows how long it will last. It could last for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
So, and again, that's where, as a politician, you think, well, okay, you look at these figures: 17 people under the age of 40 have died. Hey, let's open everything up to the under 40s. And then you look at the figures on long COVID, and you think, well, is that the responsible thing to do? And these are the kind of dilemmas that politicians are having to deal with every single day and having to make decisions on our behalf on. Now,
Yeah.
I could easily sit here and make a case immediately for everyone over the age of 70 to go into a semi-permanent lockdown for the next 6 months. But in the end, you've got to have the consent of people to do this.
True.
I know too many people. I mean, a good friend of mine has just decided, I'm not going to let my life be ruined by this. I don't care what anybody says. I am going to have someone with me on Christmas Day, come hell or high water, even if I'm not in a bubble with them. And if the population start to revolt in any meaningful way, I'm not sure what there is you can do about that. You can't have the police knocking on everybody's door on Christmas Day, checking whether Victoria Derbyshire has 7 people around her dinner table or 6. I mean, I don't want to live in that kind of country. So you've actually got to trust the people to do the right thing. But I think there is a real danger now of too many people thinking, okay, I've done my bit, I've had enough, I'm going to live my life how I want to live it.
Yeah. The breaking news: Corbyn's been suspended from the Labour Party. So Andrew Wiltshire, which I've just seen confirmed, Andrew Wiltshire, reaction writer and reader, says Jeremy Corbyn has just been suspended from the Labour Party and had the whip removed. What will this do to polite discourse on the left in the next few months?
Well, tune into LBC at 8 o'clock tonight and you'll find out. That was going to be my phone. Should Jeremy Corbyn be chucked out of the Labour Party? Well, that is quite something, isn't it? If Keir Starmer wanted a Blair moment to signify that he's going to be very different to his predecessor, that is about as different as you can get. And I watched his press conference at 11 o'clock this morning, and he said all the right things. The tone was right, the content was right. But of course, he was in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, and he was complicit in all of this, and people should remember that. But that is quite a dramatic thing for him to have done, and in many ways, credit to him for that.
Do you think, I mean, firstly, are you impressed by Starmer? And then secondly, is there a way around that argument for him? So if someone says, well, you served under Corbyn, this guy you kicked out, can he make an argument or get a hearing for an argument which is, or his surrogates can say this, look, British politics comes down to, well, English politics, not Scotland, comes down to the 2 big parties ultimately. And if you are anti-Tory, you have to coalesce around the Labour Party broadly if you want to be in power and stop the Tories getting into power. Therefore, saving that there was a balance of risk and morality, that he thought it was better on the inside, trying to fight for something a bit more like mainstream Labour, than leaving and ending his career like, say, Chuka did and lots of other Labour MPs. Is that, or does he just look opportunist?
Well, he can make that argument, and he says he spoke out in shadow cabinet. Be interesting to know what his colleagues at the time say about that. He says he spoke outside shadow cabinet. Well, they all did. They all abhorred anti-Semitism, and then went and campaigned for Jeremy Corbyn to be prime minister. Now he could then say, "Yeah, but I knew he wouldn't be prime minister. I was just going through the motions, and if I'd resigned, I couldn't have then stood for the leadership of the Labour Party, and I couldn't do all the wonderful things that I'm doing now." That is an argument. I don't think it washes with many swing voters, I have to say. But look, if I was Keir Starmer and I'd been elected leader of the Labour Party on the 4th of April, and we're now on October the 29th, I would think I'd done quite a good job so far. He's had quite a friendly press, but he's been. You wouldn't want to become leader of the opposition at a time of national crisis, because inevitably you kind of have to support the government, even if your instincts are not to. But I think he's played an absolute blinder so far. He's done far better than maybe I thought he would. I still think in the long term, his biggest weakness is still about thwarting Brexit. And I mean, he can argue till he's blue in the face that he accepts it all, but he was the one that was trying to reverse it all the time. He was the architect of Labour's Brexit policy, disastrous Brexit policy at the last election. And Boris Johnson has obviously got to hope that people's memories last back to that time when it comes to the time in 2024. But I'm not going to sit here and say that his leadership has been a disaster. There are a lot of people in this country looking for a political home at the moment, and they may not have decided that he is going to offer that home, but they're giving him a chance, and that's all an opposition politician can ask for, a chance. And he doesn't frighten the electoral horses in the way that many Labour leaders do. He looks the part, which is a big part of being leader of the opposition. And I think some people like what they see. I think he suffers a little bit of a charisma deficit. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I worked out, if you go back way back in history, if you look at American presidents and British prime ministers, when you have a charismatic prime minister or president, they are almost every time followed by a dull one. Then you get another charismatic one. Then you get a dull one again. So, I mean, he fits that narrative. Or it could be Rishi Sunak, who's the rather duller one that succeeds Boris.
The fashion is going to be for technocrats is not maybe quite the right word.
Serious people for serious times.
Yeah, precisely, serious people who look as though when they're on television, as though they know that they've imbibed the briefing properly. They know what they're talking about, and they're on top of stuff.
But I mean, he's like Blair in that regard, in that Blair appealed to many moderate conservatives, and that's how he got elected. People, particularly in the south of England, voted for him because he kind of looked a bit like a Tory, and he didn't have the language of the left. Well, Keir Starmer, I think, has done quite well to mask some of his left-wing views, but he doesn't talk the language of the left. He looks like a Tory prime minister, and that's quite an asset, I think.
Yeah. So, question from Mark Sullivan, who submitted his question yesterday. The political social rows of the 70s and 80s were bigger in substance than today's disputes, he says. And you've mentioned cruise missiles, Greenham Common, miners' strike, poll tax. But he says they affected our ordinary lives less. There was no social media, only 3 TV channels until 83 or 84. And to read anything, you had to buy it at a newsagent. It says, does this recall Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message? I always think about this in terms of when people say, well, really, does it make much of a difference? What's changed is that we've moved from an edited world to an unedited world. Essentially, if you think of communication, political communication, news, everything previously ran through. I'm not saying it was better or worse. It's just how it was with the development of modern media until the internet and social media. Everything went through a desking process. For something to get on air, it had to be verified, and then it went through a sort of formal process. Same with going into a newspaper. Still plenty of mistakes and libel cases resulted, but it's a totally different mindset, isn't it?
Well, we've become our own editors now, and that's, in some ways, as a libertarian conservative, I think that's a great thing. In that, if you trust the people, you have to trust them to decide what media they want to consume as well. But we've got to a point now, and it's always been there to an extent. If you look at the national newspaper buying habits, people on the right tend to buy the Mail, Telegraph. People on the left buy the Guardian and the Mirror. I mean, that's always been the case. In the broadcast media, it's now become the case as well, where people have become distrustful of what they see as the horrible mainstream media, which is all a plot to guide us to believe in globalism or something, and that I, as a news presenter, am told what I'm allowed to say by masters at Global Radio. I've never been told what to say by anybody in 10 years, but I can say that till I'm blue in the face and nobody believes it. So in America, if you're on the right, you watch Fox News. If you're on the left, you watch MSNBC or CNN. And that is creeping over here now. Now, there's nothing wrong with opinionated news comment. At LBC, we are all encouraged to challenge us, and we have different views over the course of the day. What I think is very unhealthy is where people only ever watch media that they agree or listen to media that they agree with. So I often get people on Twitter saying, well, I really like you, Iain, but I don't like that James O'Brien. I'm never going to listen to him. Well, you actually should listen to people that you disagree with. And you can form your own arguments better if you do that. If you don't listen to them at all, how can you possibly marshal your own arguments properly?
I agree with you up to a point. I just have to make an exception for James O'Brien. But
Hidden crowd.
so we've got loads of questions. So I'm just going to we've got 6 minutes left. So I'm just going to whiz through some. Some of these are posed as questions, but I just want to make good points made by people as well. Douglas Green asks, should the rancour and lasting ill will from the Scottish IndyRef result have acted as a warning south of the border for the EU referendum? Yes, I would say. What lessons could have been learned? Which is a good question. I suppose the main lesson would be about Project Fear, wouldn't it? And that actually it sort of worked in Scotland, but it's ended up storing up all sorts of problems.
Yeah, if you were going to be running the Remain campaign again in the Brexit referendum, you would have learned a lot of lessons from that. It's a brilliant book by Joe Pike, who started with me as an intern on Total Politics, now Sky News correspondent. I published a book by him called Project Fear back in 2015, 2016, all about the Scottish independence referendum. It's one of the best political books of the last 10 years. And any Remainer that reads that will have a shudder running down their back and thinking, well, how on earth did we get that so wrong?
Fiona Thompson says, do you think the mainstream media are at all reflective now, the post the surprise with the Tory victory and Brexit?
Probably not as much as they should be. I don't think enough people did see it coming. And one of the things that I thought was fascinating, on the day after the election results, the whole political atmosphere changed. Nobody talked about a second referendum anymore. It was as if we lived in a different country. And then, of course, the withdrawal agreement went through. And had COVID not happened, I genuinely think there would have been probably a free trade agreement by now, and I still think there will be one. I think all the signs are showing that they will come to an agreement. And once that happens, I mean, we can finally move on from those divisive politics, I hope. There are very few people now who, even the Liberal Democrats, are not going to argue for rejoining the EU in their next election manifesto. So, as they say, let's move on, make the best of it. Whatever views you had in the referendum, we're out now, and surely everybody can unite in the thought that we want our country to do well.
So, reaction reader Jeremy Ornstein asks, the title of the books, Why Can't We All Get Along, implies we're not getting along. Do you think, he says, that modern media outlets have too much of a financial stake in ensuring and amplifying dispute in public discourse? He says he's a regular LBC listener, that you'd like to hear more nuanced voices of the middle way on air.
Well, that's up to those voices to ring in and take part. And I mean, certainly, I always say to my producers, I don't want a phone in just of extremes. I want sensible people. And okay, you can have an extreme view, but if you can put it forward in an articulate way, and sometimes they're actually quite difficult to argue against. And Tommy Robinson, for example, has made a career out of appearing sort of thoroughly reasonable in some ways. I think he's a thoroughly divisive figure. I don't want him on my program. He's not got any mandate from anyone. So I don't feel that I need to have him as a guest on my program. I don't like censoring any views. I don't want overt racists on my program. And if I have one, they are one of the few categories that I will just bring the fader down and move on. But I don't feel I need to give Anjem Chowdhury, for example, a platform. I mean, he was on Newsnight virtually every week at one point. I thought, what? Sure. I did a 10-minute interview with him back in, I don't know, 2011, and it's still on YouTube somewhere. And I vowed after that interview, even though I thought I gave as good as I got, he is so clever in twisting the truth, and he is just a propagandist. Again, he represents no one. He is a danger. I'm not going to have him on again. And I think sometimes you do have to make those decisions about people who you do not want to give them the oxygen of publicity. And I think the BBC do that far too often.
Two quick final questions from Mark Fox, Deputy Chairman of Reaction.
Good
Iain,
friend.
aren't you being just a bit precious here?
Here we go. Here we go.
Healthy public debate and politics have always been robust and vigorous. Isn't what we currently lack political leaders who are able to pull the nation together around the bigger issues?
Well, of course, we need robust and vigorous debate. I'm not arguing about that. That shows, Mark, you haven't read the book. We have to have vigorous debate. I don't want to have a Bundestag-style debate in the whole country, and that would be boring for everybody. I present a radio show that can be robust from time to time, but it doesn't have to be robust all the time. It is very thoughtful and reflective sometimes. You've got to have light and shade. Night follows day. I just think that yes, we can all be a bit too precious sometimes, but all I was hoping to do with the book was to effectively provoke a debate about this. And I've had so many people get in touch with me since the book came out to say, well, I got to the end of your narrative and I wasn't sure whether you'd really you diagnosed the problem, but not necessarily come up with any solutions. And that was kind of why I did the bit at the end with the 50 ways to improve public discourse. And I've had so many people who said, well, I read those, and I actually sat down for a few minutes and reflected on my own behaviour. Well, if that's what people do when they've finished reading the book, that's all I can ask for. I'm not going to change the political weather with one book. All I can hope for is that people look at themselves and think, yeah, maybe I might want to modify my behaviour on that, because I've done that myself.
Good final question from Alan Crawford. Given the rising tensions across the UK and in other European countries, Spain, and obviously the unrest that's kicking off in Italy, how do we ensure a civil, informative and diverse discourse? Because things are going to get much tougher with COVID and all the resulting economic fallout. Which I would say, well,
I endorse that. I endorse that message.
Endorse that message. Well, can I thank you, Iain, for a fascinating conversation, and thank you for your time. If you would like a signed copy of Iain's new book, go to his website, and you'll be able to buy one there and be whisked to you promptly. If you're not a Reaction subscriber, but you bought a ticket to come to today's event, try the website and please consider becoming a subscriber. You get my newsletter on politics. You get all of the great work that's done by the Reaction team and writers like Iain Dale, who's our broadcast media critic who appears every Saturday, and lots of other great people. And you get invites to events like this. So Iain, thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you to everyone for tuning in.